There's a lie many men learn early on, and it sounds appealing. They say that if you're always kind, always available, always understanding, and do everything to please a woman, she will naturally value you. It seems logical. It even seems morally correct. But when you start observing reality carefully, the same reality that Machiavelli studied with such coldness, you realize something uncomfortable. Men who try too hard to please almost always end up being the least respected. Meanwhile, other men, often less hardworking, less available, and even less nice, end up arousing more interest, more curiosity, and more attraction. This seems unfair, but it reveals a profound truth about human nature. The world doesn't function solely based on good intentions. It functions through decisions based on real human nature. And when you understand this, you begin to perceive a silent error that destroys the value of many men in relationships. An error that almost no one explains, but that Machiavelli would have recognized immediately. The question is, do you want to continue playing this game without understanding the rules? Or do you want to finally see what really happens behind the dynamics of attraction, respect, and emotional power? If something inside you awakened while listening, don't ignore that feeling. This channel isn't about videos, it's about memories. Remember who you were before the fear, before the exhaustion, before the silence. Each new video here is a different reflection of your own soul, an invitation to understand what the world never taught you. The power you seek outside has always been within you. If you feel that this journey speaks to what lives silently within you, sign up now. Not to follow yet another creator, but to reconnect with something the world tried to make you forget. Because here, every word was made to heal, each reflection to awaken, and each video serves as a reminder. You are not alone on the path back to yourself. Click on subscribe and turn the algorithm into a daily reminder of who you really are. There's a curious principle about value that few people realize, and that a keen observer of human nature like Machiavelli would immediately understand. That which is always available loses its charm. Think about it. When something can be accessed at any time, effortlessly, without waiting, without mystery, it ceases to arouse desire. This applies to objects, opportunities, and of course, to human relationships. Many men believe that demonstrating constant interest, responding instantly, and always being present proves value. It seems logical, but in practice it works the other way around. Politics guided by reality, not by ideals, shows that human desire grows when there is room for imagination. When someone is always there, predictable, available, and eager to please, the dynamic silently changes. Without realizing it, they surrender all the power of emotional negotiation. It's like a product that's always on sale. It may even be good, but nobody feels an urgency to have it. The truth is simple. Scarcity creates value. This isn't about cheap manipulation, but about understanding how the human mind reacts to availability. Even in economics, rare assets are valued. Diamonds are expensive because they are scarce. Water is abundant and therefore cheap. The psychological logic isn't much different. Now imagine a common scenario. A man meets an interesting woman and, excited, begins to show constant attention. He texts her all day, replies in seconds, and rearranges his routine to always be available. The intention is good, but the psychological effect is predictable. Gradually, he ceases to be perceived as someone rare and begins to seem like someone always accessible. Decisions based on real human nature show that people value what requires some emotional or mental effort to achieve. Think of something practical. Instead of immediately replying to all messages, he can simply continue living his own life. Work, study, meet friends, play a sport, read a book like Machiavelli's The Prince, or even Sun Tzu's The Art of War. It's not about ignoring someone, but about not abandoning one's own life in the name of approval. This balance creates something powerful. curiosity, and curiosity generates attraction. The man who understands this demonstrates, even without saying a word, something that Machiavelli would call virtù, the ability to act with strategic intelligence in the face of circumstances. But there's an even deeper detail. Strategic absence also communicates something invisible: autonomy. When a man doesn't need to constantly prove his worth, he exudes confidence, and confidence breeds respect. This is where another silent principle of human dynamics comes in. It's better to be feared than loved, but always avoiding being hated. In the context of relationships, this means that respect precedes affection. A man who lives for approval is rarely respected. On the other hand, one who has his own mission, his own projects, and his own discipline naturally creates a field of gravity around himself. Think of historical leaders, entrepreneurs, or admired men. They don't spend their days seeking validation. They are busy building something. This posture creates what we could call the appearance of virtue, not in a false sense, but in the strategic sense of someone who seems focused, busy, and difficult to replace. And curiously, when this scarcity of presence appears, something psychological begins to happen on the other side. The human mind begins to fill the empty spaces with imagination, and imagination is the fuel of desire. But here, an intriguing question arises. What happens when, in addition to scarcity, another even more powerful factor comes into play: emotional unpredictability? There's something curious about human psychology that few men realize. Predictability kills fascination. When someone becomes completely predictable, always available, always reacting the same way, always expressing the same emotional patterns, the other person's mind stops investing energy in that dynamic. There's no mystery, no expectation, no surprise. Machiavelli, who deeply studied the patterns of human nature, understood something essential. People are driven by stimuli, emotions, and psychological rewards. When everything is constant, the brain simply gets used to it. It's like listening to the same music every day. At first it's enchanting, then it becomes background noise. And that's exactly why many well-intentioned men end up falling into a silent error. They believe that excessive emotional consistency demonstrates character and security. And of course, character is important. But politics guided by reality, not by ideals, shows that human attraction also responds to the unexpected. It's not about being unstable or manipulative, but about not becoming an overly predictable open book. The human brain pays more attention to what it cannot predict. There's even a well-known psychological phenomenon that helps explain this: intermittent reinforcement. It's the same principle used in slot machines in casinos. You pull the lever, and sometimes you win, sometimes you don't. This unpredictability keeps the mind hooked on the game. If the machine always paid out, it would lose its appeal. If it never paid out, nobody would play. But when the reward appears unexpectedly, the brain releases dopamine and creates anticipation. Now think about human relationships. A totally predictable man, always praising, always responding in the same way, always reacting emotionally in a linear fashion, ends up creating a dynamic without mental stimulation. On the other hand, someone who possesses constant adaptability, who is sometimes deeply present, sometimes focused on their own projects, who doesn't react automatically to everything, creates a different psychological sensation. He's not an easy equation to solve. For example, instead of always agreeing, he can calmly and respectfully disagree when necessary. Instead of always validating immediately, sometimes he simply changes the subject or maintains strategic silence. This type of behavior demonstrates something that Machiavelli would call virtù, combined with fortuna, the ability to navigate situations without becoming predictable. Now, of course, this doesn't mean acting theatrically or artificially. True unpredictability comes from a rich life. When a man has projects, discipline, intellectual curiosity, and diverse interests, his energy naturally distributes itself. He doesn't live for a single person. He can spend an evening reading something that truly expands his mind. Books like Machiavelli's The Prince, Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, or even Nassim Taleb's Anti-Fragile. And the next day, be training, working, or developing something important. This kind of life creates something powerful, psychological depth. And depth generates natural unpredictability. A man doesn't react out of neediness, but by choice. He doesn't need to use calculated emotional force all the time. His very posture already communicates autonomy. And when someone realizes they can't fully predict their reactions, the mind begins to pay more attention. Curiosity becomes emotional investment, and emotional investment creates connection. But there's an even deeper layer to this dynamic, because there's an even more powerful way to influence human emotions. Something as old as the myth of Narcissus. Something that involves validation, identity, and perception. And that's where the next silent principle emerges. Now imagine a curious scene. A man enters a room full of mirrors, but only one reflects his image perfectly, illuminated, almost idealized. Naturally, he begins to approach this mirror more frequently. Not because the mirror has power of its own, but because it returns something that human beings deeply seek: recognition. This psychological phenomenon is ancient, so ancient that it appears in mythology through the story of Narcissus. And if you observe carefully, you will realize that something similar happens in many human relationships. Whoever controls the emotional mirror often controls the dynamic. Machiavelli, who understood the mechanisms of human nature like few others, knew that recognition is one of the most powerful forces that move people. But he also knew that the value of this recognition depends on how it is delivered. If validation is distributed excessively, it loses weight. If it is rare and meaningful, it becomes memorable. This is where politics guided by reality, not ideals, comes in again. Many men believe that constantly praising, validating everything, and always agreeing creates a deep connection. But in practice, this often creates the opposite effect: trivialization. When validation becomes constant, it ceases to be perceived as valuable. Think of something simple. Imagine two people praising someone. The first praises every 5 minutes. The second speaks little, observes more, and when they acknowledge something, they do so in a specific and genuine way. Which of these two validations seems more powerful? Naturally, the second, because there is emotional scarcity. This doesn't mean denying recognition, but delivering it intelligently. Decisions based on real human nature show that the brain values more what it doesn't receive all the time. A practical example: instead of constantly praising appearance, a man might recognize something deeper: an intelligent attitude, a moment of courage, a unique way of seeing the world. This creates a different kind of connection. It's not just superficial validation, it's psychological recognition. And when this recognition comes from someone who doesn't seem desperate to please, it gains even more weight. At this point, something reminiscent of Machiavelli's principle of the appearance of virtue emerges. The man doesn't need to display power or control. His posture already communicates emotional balance. But there's an even more interesting detail. When someone becomes the mirror, reflecting another person's true qualities, something subtle happens. The mind begins to associate that recognition with the presence of the person offering it. It's almost as if that mirror becomes rare and therefore valuable. And curiously, this doesn't require manipulation or cheap psychological games. It only requires self-control and awareness. The man who understands this doesn't distribute validation like someone throwing confetti at a party. He chooses the right moments. This demonstrates something very close to the concept of virtu and fortuna, acting with strategic intelligence in the face of circumstances. At the same time, he also understands an essential principle of Machiavelli. It's important to avoid being hated. In other words, validation doesn't disappear completely. It just ceases to be automatic. It becomes meaningful. And when that happens, something interesting begins to emerge in the emotional dynamic, because when validation isn't guaranteed, people start trying to earn it. But this reveals another silent trap that many men fall into without realizing it: the pedestal trap. There's a silent mistake many men make without realizing it. They place women on an invisible pedestal. It's not something declared, it doesn't appear in explicit words, but it appears in their posture, their attitudes, and the way they position themselves. When someone automatically places themselves below another, trying to impress, please, or avoid any kind of disagreement, they send a very clear psychological signal: hierarchy. And in human relationships, emotional hierarchy almost always defines the power dynamic. Machiavelli, a keen observer of human nature, understood that respect is born from balance, not submission. That's why his vision was always based on decisions guided by reality, not by ideals. Many men believe that agreeing with everything demonstrates kindness and admiration. But the real effect is often different. When someone never disagrees, never challenges ideas, never expresses their own vision, they cease to be perceived as an equal. And curiously, attraction rarely flourishes where there is no equality of position. Now consider something simple that happens in everyday life. A couple talks about any topic: a movie, a book, an opinion about work or life. A man who is always trying to please tends to automatically agree with everything. Even when he thinks differently, he avoids expressing his viewpoint so as not to create discomfort. The intention seems good, but the consequence is predictable. He becomes predictable and emotionally neutral. A man who has conviction, however, acts differently. If he disagrees, he says so, calmly, respectfully, and confidently. Something like, "Look, I see this differently." There is no aggression, no unnecessary confrontation. There is only authenticity. This creates something extremely powerful: psychological presence. Because at that moment, he demonstrates that he has his own thoughts. This type of posture is very reminiscent of the Machiavellian principle of the appearance of virtue combined with the calculated use of force, not in the sense of aggression, but in the sense of strategic firmness. He doesn't need to raise his voice. His position already communicates confidence. A practical example helps to understand this better. Imagine a meeting where the conversation turns to the topic of life choices. A man who idolizes her tends to respond to everything in an impressionistic way. Yes, of course, you're always right. Someone who keeps their feet on the ground might respond something like, "I understand your point, but I see a risk in that." This small difference completely changes the dynamic. The conversation ceases to be a search for approval and becomes an exchange between equals. And this exchange generates respect. Machiavelli spoke about the importance of avoiding being hated, but he also knew that respect comes when someone demonstrates inner strength. This is where the idea of virtù and fortuna comes in again. Knowing how to act according to the moment without losing one's own position. The man who destroys the pedestal does not devalue the woman, quite the contrary. He simply removes the illusion of artificial hierarchy. And when this happens, something interesting begins to emerge. The conversation gains positive tension, presence, and curiosity. But there is an even more powerful element in this dynamic. Something that often speaks louder than any word: silence. There is a type of power that almost no one notices, precisely because it makes no noise. In a world where everyone talks too much, explains too much, and tries to justify every thought, silence becomes rare. And that which is rare always attracts attention. Machiavelli, who carefully observed human behavior in courts and political games, understood something fundamental. Those who talk too much end up revealing more than they should. Excessive words often leak intentions, insecurities, and even weaknesses. Silence, however, creates something different. It creates space for interpretation, and the human mind has a curious habit. When there is empty space, it tries to fill it. That is why politics guided by reality, not by ideals, shows that silence often communicates more than long speeches. A man who talks all the time tries to convince. A man who speaks only when necessary conveys control, and control silently generates respect. Consider a common situation. In a conversation, someone makes a provocative or unexpected comment. An insecure man tends to react immediately. He explains, defends himself, tries to justify himself. He feels he needs to respond at that instant to protect his image. But a man with emotional control reacts differently. Sometimes he simply listens, pauses, and responds only when he feels the response truly matters. This small pause changes everything because it demonstrates something extremely rare these days: self-control. This is where a silent principle emerges, very reminiscent of Machiavelli's calculated use of force. Not every provocation deserves a response. Not every conversation needs to be filled with words. Often a simple smile or a change of subject communicates more confidence than any argument. Silence, when used intelligently, is not empty. It is presence. Consider a practical example. Imagine a meeting where a moment of silence arises in the conversation. Many men panic at this moment and start talking about anything just to avoid discomfort. But someone who understands human dynamics realizes that silence can also be a space for connection. They can simply look around, observe the environment, or comment calmly when the conversation naturally returns. This type of posture demonstrates something close to the concept of virtù and fortuna, the ability to act naturally in the face of circumstances, without anxiety. And curiously, when someone feels comfortable in silence, they convey something powerful: emotional independence. They don't need to fill the room to prove their worth. They are simply present. This recalls another principle that Machiavelli deeply valued: avoid being hated, but never appear weak. Balanced silence conveys exactly that. It's not arrogance, it's not coldness, it's stability. And when this stability appears, something interesting happens on the other side. The other person begins to invest more energy in the conversation, trying to understand what is happening in that silent space. But there is an even deeper level of emotional power, a point where silence ceases to be mere presence and becomes a strategic choice, the genuine willingness to leave. There is a moment when all the previous principles converge at a single silent point. This point is simple to understand, but extremely difficult to live by. It is the ability to be independent. Machiavelli observed something very clear about human behavior. Those who need something too much rarely possess real power over it. Dependence creates submission. Self-sufficiency creates freedom, and freedom generates respect. Therefore, when we talk about human relationships, true strength never comes from trying to hold someone back. It comes from the ability to move on if something ceases to make sense. This is one of the clearest expressions of politics guided by reality, not by ideals. Many men grow up hearing romantic stories about endless persistence, constant sacrifice, and absolute dedication. But when we observe reality with strategic coldness, we perceive something different. The man who has purpose, direction, and his own life does not need to beg for anyone's presence. He appreciates, values, shares, but does not depend. This principle completely changes the attitude. Consider two scenarios. In the first, a man feels he needs the woman's constant approval. Every silence from her makes him anxious. Every change in her behavior makes him insecure. He tries to resolve everything quickly, as if he were always trying to avoid losing something. In the second scenario, there is a man who also values the relationship, but has a structured life. He has projects, discipline, friends, interests, and clear goals. He works, studies, perhaps invests his money intelligently, learning about assets, reading books like Benjamin Graham's The Intelligent Investor or Ray Dalio's Principles, and builds something of his own. This man is not emotionally trapped. He chooses to be there. He doesn't need to be there. This difference creates something powerful, psychological gravity. When someone realizes that you have your own world, that your happiness doesn't depend exclusively on that relationship, respect arises. This type of attitude reflects something Machiavelli would call virtù, the inner strength that allows one to navigate circumstances without losing autonomy. But there's an important detail here. The willingness to leave isn't a theatrical threat. It's not a game of manipulation or childish pride. It's simply a consequence of someone who has clear boundaries. Avoiding being hated, another important principle in Machiavelli's view, means acting with dignity, not arrogance. When something ceases to be healthy, a man with emotional stability knows how to withdraw serenely. He doesn't beg, doesn't create drama, doesn't try to control the other. He simply follows his own path. And curiously, this posture creates something that many try to force unsuccessfully: genuine attraction. Because human beings value what has autonomy, what chooses to stay but could also leave. This is the essence of constant adaptability, the ability to maintain one's own axis regardless of the circumstances. And when someone reaches this level of stability, an even deeper perception emerges, something that completely transforms the way one sees these dynamics, because in the end, none of these principles were really created to control another person. They reveal something much greater. True control has always been over oneself. There comes a point when all these ideas seem to point to a kind of external strategy, but in reality, they reveal something much deeper. The mistake many men make is believing that these principles exist to control a woman's behavior. That's not it. Machiavelli, when he spoke about power, was never just talking about dominating others. He was talking about understanding human nature, starting with his own. Ultimately, each of these principles points to an internal transformation. Politics guided by reality, not by ideals, demands that men stop acting based on romantic illusions or unrealistic expectations. It demands that they observe reality as it is. And reality shows something uncomfortable for many. The world respects those who respect themselves first. Not those who beg for approval, not those who try to please everyone, not those who live in fear of losing someone. This kind of awareness requires courage, because it means abandoning the identity of the nice guy who lives trying to be accepted by everyone. And that often hurts, but it also liberates. Think about it practically. A man begins to work on himself, not to impress someone, but to build real value. He improves his physical health, starts training, organizes his finances, develops professional skills, and expands his mind. He might study strategy, leadership, psychology, history. He might read authors like Machiavelli, Marcus Aurelius, Robert Greene, or even modern works on human behavior. Gradually, he notices something curious. His energy changes. He no longer enters conversations trying to prove his worth. He doesn't need to convince anyone that he deserves respect. His posture communicates this naturally. This process is exactly what Machiavelli would call virtù combined with fortuna, the ability to develop inner strength and seize opportunities when they arise. The man stops acting as someone seeking validation and begins to act as someone who builds meaning. He doesn't need to constantly use calculated force because his very presence demonstrates stability. And this is where the real turning point happens. When a man abandons the need to please everyone, he begins to live more authentically. He understands something few realize. It's better to be feared than loved, but always avoiding being hated. In other words, it's better to be respected for who you are than to be loved for an artificial version created solely to please. This understanding changes how he positions himself in the world. He stops living by reacting to others' expectations and begins to build his own direction. And curiously, when this transformation happens, many of the dynamics that previously seemed confusing become clear. Because the true objective was never to control another person. The true objective was always to master oneself. When this happens, the man ceases to be merely someone trying to gain attention and begins to become someone who naturally attracts respect. And it is precisely at this point that many realize something disconcerting. If all this is true, then why do 99% of men continue to make the same silent mistake in relationships? Now stop for a moment and think honestly. How many times in your life have you tried to be the perfect man to please someone? How many times have you answered too quickly, over-explained yourself, given in too much just to keep someone's attention? Most men do this without realizing it. They believe that the more effort they put into pleasing others, the more value they will have. But reality, that same reality observed by Machiavelli, shows something different. The world respects men who possess inner structure. Men who understand politics guided by reality, not by ideals. Men who know when to speak, when to be silent, when to get close, and when to simply follow their own path. This doesn't mean becoming cold, manipulative, or arrogant. It means developing something much more powerful, self-control. Because ultimately, none of these principles exist to control another person. They exist to teach something much greater. They teach that respect is born when a man builds his own life. When he possesses purpose, discipline, vision, and direction. When he understands that virtue and fortune go hand in hand. Preparation and opportunity. When he learns to use constant adaptability in the face of life's circumstances. And especially when he understands something that many ignore. It's better to be feared than loved, but always avoiding being hated. In other words, it's better to be respected for who you truly are than to be loved for an artificial version created only to please others. This is the moment when the nice guy stops living seeking approval and begins to live building real value. Now I want to ask you some important questions. Be honest with yourself. Have you been living trying to please others or trying to evolve? Are you building a life that naturally generates respect? Or are you waiting for someone to recognize your worth first? And even more importantly, what kind of man do you want to be in 5 years? The one who keeps repeating the same patterns, or the one who finally decides to change his own attitude towards life? If this kind of knowledge has opened your mind in any way, then you already know the next step. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because here we explore life strategies, personal power, and understanding human nature in ways that few dare to explain clearly. And tell me in the comments, which of these principles has most changed your perspective on relationships? Sometimes, a single change in mindset can completely transform the course of your life.